Hello, one and all, and welcome to the podcast we call the Fantastival with myself, Steve Nussbaum. In the podcast, I invite my guests to come on, talk to me all about their musical taste, their memories, their experiences, and they get to collect their fantasy festival, which I have christened Fantastival. We are now on episode 139. I hope everyone's having an amazing week. And if you're listening to this on the Sunday, the day this podcast is released, I now have an 11-year-old daughter. So happy birthday, Jess. She doesn't listen. She's too cool for a music podcast, but hopefully when she comes back to listen to this podcast in a number of years, she can look back and smile as she's getting a birthday shout out now. And I must also say a massive thank you to Laurie Wright for being my guest on the last episode of this podcast. And his fantastic Get On The End Of It album is definitely one of my albums of the year so far. And I love the fact that he was on the pod. Not only was he a great guest, but also a top man to boot. So if you've not listened to that album or that episode after this one, go back and please have a listen. You will not regret it. But like I said, this is all about episode 139. And this week, I'm delighted to be joined by this gent, the host of the brilliant Indie Brunch on Louder Than War Radio, and just generally an awesome human being. It's Iain Key.
Hello, you all right?
All good, Ian. Thanks so much for coming on to the wonderful world of the Fantastival Podcast. I know you've got your own music show and you're well into music. I'm looking forward to hearing all about your musical stories, your tastes, your experiences. But before we do, always like to check in with my guests to find out how they're doing, mate. So, Ian, how are you?
I'm very well, Steve. Very well. In a good place, loving life. I've got to that stage in life where I don't feel I need to be overly ambitious and just enjoying the things I do outside of work.
So what things do you do outside of work? So let's find out a bit more about Ian, the person. So I obviously know you as obviously someone who's into their music, who listens to the podcast, who's got their own music show. But what do you like to do, Ian?
Most of it is music related, really. I do support Man United, and I have done all my life. I had season tickets up until COVID for 30 odd years, but gave them up now, so it's like a case of watching on telly or occasionally getting offered tickets. My girlfriend Jill, she's a keen walker, so we when I met her, I was obviously into music, she was into walking, so now she comes to gigs with me and I go out on 10-mile hikes with her. So, and I've got a 16-year-old son, Mackenzie, who also enjoys music. He's been going to gigs with us since he was 10. His first gig was Billy Bragg. And yeah, he's always at gigs with us. And by the time this has gone out, hopefully we've been to see Meryl Streep supporting Pill, the Ritz in Manchester.
Amazing. So it looks like you're doing everything right with parenting. And I saw that he hosted your radio show a few weeks ago in your absence.
Yeah, I only offered him to do it for a week. And then his playlists were that good that he came up with one show and then he was like, oh, and I've got this other show as well. So it's like, oh, you can do it 2 weeks then.
Brilliant. Keeping it running in the family.
Yeah, and all of those were his own choices as well. There wasn't anything on there that I picked. It was literally all him. And then on the second show, he had people like Ben from Battery Farm and Roy from the Shed Project. He'd contacted them and said, can you give me a little thing to run as an intro for it? So I produced them for him, but he did all the work.
Sounds amazing. So if anyone wants to go listen to that, we'll obviously give the details for Ian's and the radio show a bit later. But come back to your own music taste, Ian. Let me take you back to when you was a smaller nipper. What are your earliest music memories? What do you remember about being a kid in music?
I'm not sure if this is a false memory, but I think it's pretty true. My first memory I remember of sitting down listening to an album was the Bay City Rollers' Once Upon a Star during the second half of Man United versus Southampton in the Cup final in 1976. And I think I'd been built up to this match was going to be amazing, and then the first half was rubbish. So my sister let me go and listen to one of her records.
And that was it from there, a key music fan?
Yeah, well, my parents were that kind of sort of like weird age where they were teenagers sort of during the Second World War. So by the time sort of like rock and roll and things like that started, they'd already settled down and had kids. So it's only through my older siblings that I really sort of like listened to music. So like my elder sister, she had the collection of Beatles oldies. My brother was into the kind of late Beatles and sort of like rock that was going on in the early 70s. And I call her my younger sister, but she's still eight years older than me. But she was into like the Clash and the Jam, and Blondie and stuff like that. So that was the kind of stuff that I was really like picking up.
And from there, right, did you ever try and get into playing an instrument? Was that ever for you? Did you just think, no, I'm not interested in playing, I'm just a keen gig goer?
Many, many years later, somebody gave me a guitar and it needed fixing, so I took it to Johnny Roadhouse in Manchester and they fixed it for us. And then the guy was like, look, it works. And he sat down and played it, and he was playing like Layla or something like that. And I was like, right, nice one. And went home, bought a little amp, plugged it in, and it just went, meh. And I was like, no, it's not for me.
Not for me. So,
no. Having said that, going back to when I was probably like 16, some of my friends from school were in a band in the Midlands called Enclosed Life, and they played at like a Christmas school party, and I just loved the buzz of what was going on backstage about everybody getting ready and like all that, the sort of like promotional stuff and all that. And so it's like I was always more interested in behind the scenes than doing something out front.
And did that kind of lead to where you ended up in your career then? So I obviously read your Twitter blurb and it said you used to manage Northside, which I didn't know until I read that. So to kind of tell us about that journey and how that came about.
Oh, Christ. Well, after leaving school, I got a proper job. I was on a youth training scheme, but this was like Manchester in 86, 87. So I was always into music, so I was into collecting music. I was going to gigs at venues like the International in Manchester, where it was owned by Gareth Evans, who used to manage the Stone Roses and stuff like that. So I saw loads of like indie bands like the Primitives and Soup Dragons and Mighty Lemon Drops and stuff like that. And then I had proper jobs up until the early 90s, really. I was really into the Manchester scene. And then in the back of the NME, there was an advert for a music industry management course at Newark and Sherwood Technical College. So I decided rather than I was going to give up my job and go and do that, and I did that. And then I already knew some of the guys in Northside, and I knew various people around. And then basically, this is just after Factory had gone bust as well, so they didn't have a label, they weren't signed to anybody, but they didn't have a manager. And somebody said to us, well, you know what you're doing, so we've got this gig in Birmingham, how do we get there? Kind of thing. And then it kind of went from there, really. I was like, right, well, I'll manage you. And this would have been mid-95, 95, sorry. And then I ended up doing that for 18 months. We arranged a few gigs. I managed to persuade the bank to give me a loan to buy a car, even though I've never learned to drive. Put them in the studio, recorded some demos, and did my best.
Fantastic stuff. And obviously, do you still keep in contact with any of the guys from Northside?
Yeah, I still speak to Dermo regularly. We chat. Not so much the other ones, but I've seen him a couple of times recently. I've seen him live and then I've had a coffee with him as well. And
it seems Dermo's career is kind of going well at the moment. He's doing quite a lot of gigs. He's playing with, I think, Aziz as well, that I think I've seen.
Yeah, he's been doing quite a lot. And I think there's a couple of things happened, I think, because Tim Burgess did a listening party last year, and I think that kind of, he didn't realise how many people out there actually loved what he was doing. Mm. And I think he was already working on stuff at the time anyway, but that just gave him a bit of a boost. And it's great to see him getting some of the recognition now that he deserves, because it was difficult for a long time. They got a lot of a backlash for sort of like the end of the Manchester scene kind of thing. So it's like, it's like you used to see, they were like the butt of the jokes kind of almost in the music press, but there's been a reappraisal certainly over the last 5-6 years, which has been long overdue.
So I guess after your music management of Northside, you've obviously kept your toe into music, and now, I guess, leaping forward, you're now part of Louder Than War, right? So that's not only...
No, after Northside, I gave up for 25 years.
Oh, really? All right. So was it lockdown that kind of made you get back involved in it?
Yeah. After Northside split up, I remember not a couple of days after Northside's last gig, I went to a party and this kid was telling me how much brilliant life I must have. And I went home after this party, and it's like I was living in a shared house at the time, and the other 3 people had gone away for Christmas. I think it was like the 22nd of December. And the phone had been cut off. I had half a pint of milk and a bit of cheese that had gone off in the fridge. And that was it. And this kid was like, oh, you must have an amazing life. And I was like, no. So after that, I actually went and got a proper job in telecoms. And I've been working in telecoms ever since. But then, yeah, during lockdown, one of my best mate, Paul, who's he's an actor. He's always been very creative, and he's always been saying, oh, you should do something, you should write a music thing, you should do whatever. And I always just kind of brushed it off. And then during lockdown, he was doing a lot of stuff on Twitter, and ITV were picking up on it and doing things. So I thought, well, I'll have a look at what I've done. And then I ended up finding there was quite a lot of things I'd written from like the 80s through over the years, just like random bits, which to me it was like people used to put things in the NME saying like, oh, writing a book about the Smiths, so if anybody wants to contribute, write this and tell us what your favourite song is or whatever. So I used to do things like that just to do it, really. So during lockdown, I ended up putting a blog together of everything I'd written over the years. And then I was like, it was just supposed to be there, and that was it. And then I thought, well, people are sat at home doing nothing, so I can reach out to them and, you know, have a chat, you know, do interviews with them and things like that. And at this time, I'd just started really going to gigs again as well, not long before. And there was a band called Fight Milk who I saw, I thought were fantastic. So I just reached out to them on Twitter and then just started doing like interviews over email with people and putting them on the blog. And then a couple of people sent me CDs and things to review. And then somebody I've known since the 80s, he messaged me and said, do you want to interview Tony Davidson? Now, that's what, years ago, in 1995, I'd interviewed Tony Wilson for City Life. And then I was kind of like, well, I've interviewed somebody now, so I'm quite happy that's my journalism days are over. And then Tony Davidson is quite often overlooked in the Manchester music story. He was the guy who set up the rehearsal rooms where Joy Division, The Fall, Mick Hucknall, all the bands used to rehearse. And my mate said, do you want to interview him? So I was like, well, isn't he dead? Because this is like, you're thinking, you know, this guy set this up in the 1970s. Yeah. You're thinking, well, he must be knocking on a bit now. Anyway, it turns out he was only in his 20s when he did it. So I ended up interviewing him. And then as a byproduct of that, one of his best mates is Nigel Carr, who co-owns Louder Than War. And so I published this interview on my blog, thinking no more of it. And then I got a message from Nigel going, do you want to come and write for us? And I was like, well, I'm not a writer. And he was like, well, neither are we. So I was like, oh, okay then. So then, so from there, I got offered a place writing on Louder Than War, and that was just over 3 years ago.
Amazing. And as well as writing for Louder Than War, you also host the brilliant Indie Brunch. So I'm aware that writing and hosting are two very separate things. So how did the hosting come around then? Well,
I mean, it's coming up to 2 years now. Basically, Nigel used to have the show on one of the local radio stations, and it was just the Louder Than War show. And he had a falling out with the people who owned the radio station through their choice of politics. And basically said, sod you, then I'm going to set up a Louder Than War radio station, which was in, I think it was October 2021, he said that. And then early in November, he was like, does anybody want to do a show? And I thought, well, why not? It must just be like doing a mixtape or something. So I did that, and it's been going since. It's like I've never expected it to last. I didn't know how long it'd last. I didn't really think about it. I mean, the first show took me 8 hours to put together because every time I made a mistake, I stopped.
Yeah.
And then re-recorded it. And then I realised it's just easier to keep talking and edit afterwards, obviously. But yeah, it was just like bought a cheap mic to plug into my computer, got told what software to use, and went from there.
Amazing. And if no one's listened to Indie Brunch, what can people expect, right? So it's a 2-hour show. You have a guest on.
2-hour show over Saturday lunchtime, so it's 11 till 1 on a Saturday. I tend to have a guest every week, so it could be somebody familiar that you know. A lot of people sort of like, it's a great social thing on Twitter, so there's a lot of people that would probably know a lot of the bands that I have on. You know, a lot of the up-and-coming bands. I've had I've had The Shop Window on there, Roy from the Shed Project's been on there, I've had Fight Milk on there, Nervous Twitch, people like that. But then I've also had Billy Bragg, Rick Buckler, Kevin Rowland, Billy Duffy from the Cult, Mike Peters from the Alarms. So I mix it up with people that, people will be aware of and others that, they won't be aware of. And as well as musicians, I have like writers, photographers, things like that as well.
Brilliant. It's a brilliant...
They basically pick a choice of songs to play, which is threaded through the interview. Then I've got, that leaves me half an hour kind of before and after to play like new tunes or slip in a couple of old classics.
Oh, well done. It's a brilliant show. And if anyone can't listen between a Saturday, they can then go on Mixcloud, right? So people can go back and play it back on Mixcloud where they can find the entire 2-hour show. If someone wants to listen, Iain, what's the best way to go? How would someone find it?
Like you say, from 2:00 on a Saturday, it's on Mixcloud. It goes out live on the Louder Than War app, which is available on Android and iOS, but it's also on the streams via the Louder Than War website as well.
Great stuff. I highly recommend anyone who hasn't heard Iain's shows to go and check it out. So, Iain, you've already mentioned some amazing bands and acts already, but in terms of your musical tastes, without giving away too many spoilers, what are you into?
What I'm listening to at the moment, or in general?
Just in general.
In general, I love indie stuff, so... and obviously a lot of Manchester stuff as well, so like obviously the Smiths, Joy Division, New Order, The Fall. I collect a lot of things like that, and then love, The Wedding Present, and at the moment listening to people like Meryl Streep, Ed Sheeran, Benefits, but then I like country music, I like the Beatles, so I've got a really varied taste.
It does sound like there's a varied taste, and you mentioned some great bands there. So let me take you back then and ask you about your first record or your first single. You already mentioned the Bay City Rollers, but I'm not going to include that as your first actual record. But what do you remember about your first record and buying it?
Well, I'll give you two, because the first record I remember going and buying, but my mum was with me and told me which one I could buy, was Shawaddy Waddy's Under the Moon of Love.
Nice.
There was something else I probably wanted to buy more, but it was kind of like, no, this is the one that you buy. So I was like, right, okay. The first single I actually bought with my own money off my own back was Don't You Want Me by the Human League. And I think it was after we'd had some, I can't remember what year of school it was, but it had been like the Christmas disco kind of thing. I remember hearing it and seeing the video on Top of the Pops and going buying that.
Classic, still holds up to this day. Human League still going strong. I think they've just announced the 2024 tour.
Yeah.
So fair play to them. So, Iain, this podcast is all about people collating their fantasy festival, and you'll get to collate yours shortly. Are you a big fan of the festivals? Have you been to many?
I'm not a great fan of outdoor gigs, to be fair. I was at Spike Island, and yes, it was a great day, but it was bloody hot. There was no concessions. People were falling over because everybody was just thirsty. The sound was shit, but it was a great experience to be there with those people. But I'm not a massive fan of outdoor gigs. It's like, especially in Manchester, because there's always a chance of it raining. And whether that's rain or people throwing pints of piss around, I don't know. But I'm not a big fan of outdoor gigs, to be fair. So I've been to a lot, but and nothing against like the Stone Roses and things like that. I mean, it's like I saw them back in the day, but I can't imagine anything worse than when they reformed to go and stand in a field in the rain, surrounded by drunk people. Do
you think that's a case though of losing the romanticism of youth though? So I felt that way about going to watch Liam at Nebworth, and I thought, well, why do I want to go and see Liam at Nebworth? Because I was there as a 16-year-old in 96, so why would I want to go back as a 41-year-old after I was there? Do you think that's because, again, as you get older, maybe you lose a feeling, or do you just think, no, just not for me?
I think possibly it is partly losing that feeling, because it's like, you sort of hang on to those memories that you had when you were young and the excitement of the day and things like that, whereas in some instances now when I'm going to a gig, if I'm going with my son, it's like I'm more interested, more kind of keeping an eye on where he is and making sure he's all right. So I don't necessarily enjoy the thought of losing him in a crowd of like 35,000 people if he decides to want to go to the toilet and then find his way back to us. So yeah, I just don't. I don't. But I prefer, and also standing up for like 8 or 9 hours as well doesn't really appeal to me anymore.
Yeah, fair shout. So what about gigs, kind of normal gigs, and I guess to phrase a coin. So do you have a favourite gig? without, again, giving away too many spoilers, is there one that stands out or a couple that stand out for you?
Well, I'll answer it in three ways, to be honest with you. Being connected to music, my favourite gig was Northside up at a venue called the Music Box in Edinburgh in 1996, promoted by a guy called Stevie Cummins, who's still a friend to this day. You got to bear in mind, Factory split up. Factory went bust in 1992, so this is like 5 years after Northside's album came out. And this venue held probably 500-600 people. We'd done the sound check and everything. We'd gone to go and get something to eat. We got back to the venue, and the security were just like, "Yeah, you can't come in. It's like too full." And we're just like, "But this is the band." And they were like, "No." So the end, eventually we got in. They did the gig, but I stood at the back of the gig. I stood behind the drums watching the whole gig, and it was mental because it was just all these. I think it might be something to do with Scotland. It's like if a band turn up in Scotland, they always get a brilliant audience. I know in some parts of the country, so like you end up with people watching and standing at the back with their arms folded, kind of like watching what's going on. But in Scotland, they were just all up for it. And I literally stood there for the whole gig just watching the reaction on the crowd. And it was just incredible, the energy that was off it. And I was just like, just to have been part of that, I was like, yeah, that's what I'm doing this for.
I'm happy you saw that when you did, because I feel like if that happened in this day and age, you would have had your phone out straight away, watching it from a phone, watching people's reactions through a phone, where there was something more innocent about that time and not.
Yeah, it was just on that cusp of things changing, I think. But yeah, that was amazing. And then, like I said, Tate McKenzie to gigs, and he would have been 11 or 12. We went to see the Smiths, spelt with a Y, at the Ritz in Manchester, because he's a big Smiths fan. And that, obviously, he listens to music at home, and they did There Is a Light, and I just turned and just stood, and I just stood, watched him, and he was like a ball of energy. He was literally jumping up and down, and he was like screaming almost every word. And this, bear in mind, he was 11 or 12 at the time, and I was like, how does he know this? All of this. And it was just one of them moments where it's just magical, to see somebody really into music and getting into music and just being caught up in that moment. So that was special. But I mean, he did it the other week as well. We went to see the South Martins at the Ritz, which I don't know if you know Andy Johnson, but he did that again. And he's like, I'm still there going, I don't remember you listening to them at home, but he literally knew every single House Martins and Beautiful South song that was performed in like an hour and a half. Better than I did.
Amazing stuff. So you've mentioned some great gigs, some great acts already.
There's one more though as well, which is one I saw as a punter. Was Roger Waters of Pink Floyd in 2003 in Manchester. Then I think it was Pink Floyd played in Manchester around 87, so no member of Pink Floyd had played in Manchester for many, many years. And he did Comfortably Numb, and there was just grown men just weeping. It was almost like a religious experience, and it's like there's people that had like obviously been waiting for a long time for this to happen. And again, it's just the power of music and what it brings.
Yeah, it absolutely is. The power of music is a wonderful thing, and it gets so many emotions going in so many different people. So you mentioned some amazing gigs there, some amazing acts, but I think now is the time to get you to collate your fantasy festival. So for anyone who's listening for the first time, like I said, the aim of the podcast is get our guests to collate their fantasy festival. So Iain gets to choose any 5 acts, one who must play one of their studio albums in full, and he gets to pick an encore, which all of his acts can play to close his fantasy festival, and that can be any song by anyone at any point. So very simple, 5 acts take 5 time slots. So for example, like I said in the last episode of the podcast, I had the awesome Rory Wright on, and he created his Right So Rock and Roll Rave Fantasy Festival. He had Leonard Cohen in his opening slot. In his super second slot, he picked Toots and the Maytals, the first time they've been picked on the podcast. In his midway madness slot, he picked the Libertines. Pre-headline act, he went for Jimi Hendrix. For his headline act, went for the Beatles. And for his encore, he went for Live Forever. So he kind of winged it in his terms, but I feel like that was the perfect festival for him and suited him down to the ground. So again, massive thank you to Laurie for coming on to that one. So before we talk about your acts, Iain, first of all, we need to give your fantasy festival a name, and we need to give it a venue. So what are you going to call the fantasy festival?
I really struggled with this. Really did. It took ages. I've gone for Eclectifest just because the lineup is very eclectic.
I love it. And do you know what? It still brings a smile to my face when people tell me how much difficulty they've had. Like, after 139 of these episodes, I still love it when people have got so into it. They've gone, oh, this was really hard or really difficult. I almost thrive in people's difficulty in getting a name and a venue and all their acts. All right, so we've got Eclectifest. Ian, you can hold us anywhere in the world. You said you don't like outdoor gigs, but Old Trafford screams to me as a potential venue for this one. Again, you've mentioned the Manchester Ritz. We don't have to hold it in Manchester. You can take us anywhere you want to take us, anywhere in the world. So where are we going to hold your fantasy festival?
I am sticking in Manchester, and again, this is another. It's thinking about venues, because I mean, romantically, it's like we had venues in Manchester, like the International I mentioned earlier, which is fantastic, but you'd probably only get about 100 people in it. So I've gone for the Albert Hall, which is my favourite venue in Manchester now.
Great shout. So the Albert Hall in Manchester is going to be your venue for Eclectifest. So before we talk about your 5 acts in, I'm more than aware how difficult this is for everyone, and I think by the smile on your face, you've also found it very difficult. Any acts you want to mention who you love, but for whatever reason aren't making it into your 5 acts?
Yeah, I mean, the Shed Project, who we mentioned earlier, the Shop Window. I'd love to see Teenage Waitress. I think Daniel's album's amazing. You know, sort of like older bands like the Soup Dragons, Primitives, Mighty Lemon Drops, many of the Manchester bands, even like people like My Chemical Romance, who I saw last year. I just love them. So there's loads and loads and loads and loads.
You mentioned some great acts there. Shed Project's been on this very podcast, as has Teenage Waitress. Yeah, I'd love to see Teenage Waitress. Soup Dragons, I've got some new activity going on, so one to watch out for there. And My Chemical Romance, I don't believe have ever been picked for a fantasy festival. So Gerard and the rest of his boys are going to have to wait on the sidelines for at least another week to be selected for a fantasy festival. So, like I said, you mentioned some awesome acts already in your missed acts and before when speaking about gigs and everything. But it's time to get your 5 into your fantasy festival. So it's 2:00. The Albert Hall in Manchester sold out. Who's going to open Eclectifest, Ian?
Well, I'm going to cheat a little bit because I'm going to have a compare.
Okay, we can do compares. That's fine.
So, a guy called Jack Horner, who goes out as Leon the Pig Farmer, who's a poet. He's also half of a band called The Dirt with his wife Sashiko. But there's a couple of things I've been to over the last couple of years where he's actually introduced the act and done some like poetry leading into it as well. So I want Jack to compare the event for me as well.
Yeah, I've just got the
that was brought on by the fact that you asked how people are at the start of the show, and Jack's I think he's in his early 50s now, but he was a squaddy until a few years ago, and he suffered from PTSD. And he found poetry was his way out of it. And now he's like going out playing all around the world. So as long as he's in this country and not Japan where he is at the moment, then definitely want him kind of introducing everybody.
Yeah, he's doing it. He's agreed. He's signed the contract. He is comparing your fantasy festival. That's all good. So we love a compare. You can have a compare. It's all good. So who's he going to introduce first onto the stage then? The
first band I picked is Shade, who are, I say young, they're in the 20s now, but a Manchester 4-piece who they signed, but they're up and coming. They played quite a lot in the north. They played in London once, I think. They got invited over to Italy to open for Louis Tomlinson a couple of weeks ago. They've released quite a few things digitally, and then they did an EP a couple of months ago as well. But they're a band that they're one of the first interviews I ever did, probably about 2019, 2020. And they've got, the first time I heard them, I thought, oh, they sound like Oasis. And then I realised that actually their parents are my age, so they probably grew up listening to Oasis. But Oliver and Adam, the drummer and the bassist, are both like heavily influenced by like Rick Buckler and Bruce Foxton. Luke, the singer's got a very Manchester drawl, so he's like instantly recognisable. But Ben, the guitarist, is just phenomenal. He's like Slash, and it's like every one of their singles that they've released so far, and a lot of the demos that I've heard, it's like everyone's an anthem. But they're an amazing band.
Great stuff. So Shade make their fantasy festival debut. I'm glad you shout out Louis Tomlinson, because obviously Louis Tomlinson takes all these new and upcoming bands and he supports lots and gives them a massive platform. So I think you've got to say massive kudos there to Louis Tomlinson, who does a great job in exposing new music.
Yeah.
So great stuff. So Shade playing 2 till 3 o'clock. Then your opening act will take a half-hour break. That'll take us to your Super Seconds, who get to play from 3:30 to 4:30.
Yeah.
So who are you going to have follow Shade in?
My second act is, she's a member of the Australian Music Hall of Fame. She's won something like 32 awards in Australia, and probably nobody's heard of her in this country. And she's a country musician called Casey Chambers. I first heard her, one of my friends that I used to live with years ago, he played a couple of times. She did a cover version of a Crowded House song, Better Be Home Soon. And then it's like, the voice is just amazing. And then I think the first album came out in like 1999, and she's released probably 13, 14 albums since. But I absolutely love her. I think she's played one gig in America, and that's the only time she's probably played outside Australia.
I know her. Well, I don't know her.
Oh.
In my younger days of working in HMV shops, I was putting the specs counter in HMV Covent Garden, and we used to play these country artists. And so I know Barricades and Brick Walls, which is a phenomenal album by Casey Chambers, and I've got it. I listened to it about a year. It comes on every year, and I'm like, that is a corker. So she's got a great voice, hasn't she? And it's great production.
Yeah.
So first time she's been mentioned on the podcast. I actually emailed her when this podcast started, thinking she's not big in the UK, I might be able to get her. And I think I might have got a reply from her manager. I can't quite remember, but that was like ages ago. But obviously, she never came on the podcast. But I might approach her again now that she's come up on here. But yeah, great choice.
Yeah, I must admit, I'm waiting. I keep an eye out to see if she's releasing anything new, because I would love to speak to her and have her on my show.
All right, me and you have to find it out then for Casey.
Yeah.
But yeah, around that time you had kind of Casey Chambers, a Dixie chick started emerging.
Yeah,
Kathleen Edwards. Don't know if you heard of Kathleen Edwards? She's amazing. That first album, Failure, is an absolute banging. All these female artists started coming up at the same time, probably off the back of Shania Twain to a certain extent, who kind of sounded a bit like him. But great choice, Casey Chambers. For anyone who hasn't heard of Casey Chambers before, go and check her out, and obviously we'll plug a playlist later on, but a great act. All right, so she's going to play from 3:30 to 4:30, then we'll take another half-hour break. That'll take us to 5 o'clock, and it'll be time for the Midway Madness slot at your fantasy festival, Ian. So who's going to play in your Midway Madness slot?
I want to have Self-Esteem doing the Prioritise Pleasure album.
Great shout. So why Self-Esteem, your Midway Madness, and why have you picked that album for them to play?
I saw her do it at the Albert Hall back in March, and it was just an amazing gig, and it was very choreographed, and it's not something that I particularly like that. You know, it's like you want that the rough edges and stuff, but it was really, really slick, and it was just so well done. And I just think she's a phenomenal artist. I love the way that she is on Twitter with people. She's very open, she's very honest, and she doesn't really give a fuck about anything, and it's just really refreshing, her attitude.
Great stuff. So Self-Esteem makes her Fantastival debut as well. So Ian, 2 weeks ago we had Mickey Birini on. She picked 5 new acts. At the moment we're 3 for 3 with Shade, Casey Chambers and Self-Esteem. So
I'll be shocked if the next 2
You never know.
Haven't been picked before, to be fair. I'm sure they will have been.
You'll never know. So Self-Esteem, Midway Madness playing from 5 till 6. We'll take another half-hour break. That will take us to 6:30. It'll be time for your pre-headline act. We get an hour and a half to play. So Ian, who's going to be your pre-headliners?
Some of the top 2 bands, or artists rather, are the 2 acts that I've seen probably more than anyone else, apart from Northside. Probably more than Northside actually as well. So because they never do encores, I've picked The Wedding Present as my second choice.
Okay, so The Wedding Present obviously make it in as your pre-headliners. I didn't know they never play encores. Why is that? Is it just...
They just never have done. It's always been a standing joke. Obviously, they've got a hardcore fan base, so everybody knows it, and the question always gets, or they always say before the end of the gig, you know, as you know, we never do encores, but I've seen them. The first time I saw The Wedding Present was probably 1987. I saw them in May, and I've just booked to see them in May next year as well. But it's like Mackenzie's one of his favourite bands as well. It's just always a cracking gig.
So they get an hour and a half. Obviously, they've got a massive catalogue. Any era or any tracks you'd have them play, or would...
You know what? Even Dave Gedge, he doesn't pick the sets anymore. He leaves it to the drummer or the bass player or the guitarist or whatever. They pick the tracks. So anything really. It's like there's that much good stuff in the back catalogue that I'm quite happy just seeing them.
Great shout. So the wedding present, only the second time they've been picked for a fantasy festival, and both times they've been pre-headliners. So wedding present played many moons ago in Sally Wood's fantasy festival. They're playing Eclectic Fest as well in your pre-headline act. So they're going to play from 6:30 to 8 o'clock. We're going to take one more half-hour break, and it'll be time for your headline act. You're going to get 2.5 hours on stage. So an amazing first 4 acts. But Iain, who's going to headline Eclectic Fest?
Well, the person who's going to headline is my all-time hero. Somebody lent me his first, a girl called Alison Gatehouse lent me his first album in 1984, and I was hooked, and I've bought everything since many times over. So that's Billy Bragg.
Billy Bragg. So you've been listening for almost 40 years to Billy Bragg.
I'm just about to review his box set, which is coming out to celebrate his 40th year in the business.
So I guess my first question is obviously, what does his music mean to you? Secondly, I think you said you've interviewed him, which I want to ask you about, because there aren't many people who have interviewed the Fantasy Festival headliner as well. So I guess first of all, what does Billy Bragg kind of mean to you as an actor or as an artist?
Well, as a 14-year-old, first hearing it and hearing the politics and the music, and because I was slightly too young for like the jam and the specials and things like that. So when I was hearing Billy Bragg when I was 14, it was just like, things like To Have and To Have Not. It was just like, it's not you, you can do this. It's, don't let the bastards grind you down kind of thing. But it was also like the intelligence in his writing, just sort of like learning about politics and things like that. And then, when he started going slightly wider afield, it's just like the love songs that he was writing, just like so brilliant. And then even like in the most recent decade, it's like things like Never Buy the Sun and things like that. He's always kept that edge about him, and I think there's always been an educational element to his music as well as when you go and see him, it's like part performance, part stand-up comedy, part political kind of outing as well. So it's just the complete package, really.
And then how did you find interviewing him? Because obviously you've been listening to him, like you said, since 1984. I take it you've interviewed him fairly recently.
I interviewed him in, I think it was November or December last year, and I'm hoping to interview him again soon. I was shitting myself, to be honest with you. I was really, really nervous, but I probably learned more in that interview than I have done in any other interview, because he turned up about 15 minutes late, and I only have like 30 or 40 minutes to interview, and I was thinking, I was almost ready for hanging up, and he come on and he was apologetic, and I was like, all right, yeah. And he was like, but as soon as we started, it was a conversation. And it was like you're talking to your mate who you haven't spoken to for a couple of weeks. And the way that he kind of speaks, and it's just the way that he positions things, and like it's just like, I'll just tell you a story about this. And obviously a lot of it will be well rehearsed, but then I was throwing questions at him about West Ham and stuff like that, and saying, how do you reckon David Moyes is going to do? And so there's things that I was asking him which he probably hasn't. It doesn't normally get asked by the Guardian or whatever. So you build up a rapport with him very, very quickly. But no, it was an absolute joy to interview. And
you get to interview him again soon, you were saying, for his upcoming box set. So be like Friends Reunited, hopefully.
Well, I've got the questions already written. I'm just waiting to hear back because he's in Europe at the moment, and then he's got a couple of weeks before he starts his UK tour. So it really depends if he's got the time. If he hasn't got the time to have a chat on Zoom, then hopefully I'll be able to just send him some questions over and incorporate that into the review.
Well, fingers crossed that comes off. So Billy Bragg is your headliner. He gets to play from 8:30 to 11 o'clock. Second time he's been chosen. So he was chosen many moons ago as an opening act on Jeremy Michael's Fantasy Festival, which I think was like in the early 30s. So Billy Bragg returns after 100 or so odd episodes to headline Eclectic Fest. And at 11 o'clock, he's going to bring back on stage The Wedding Present, Self-Esteem, Casey Chambers, and Shade. I can see why you called it Eclectic Fest, because all 5 acts are quite different, which is fantastic. And they're all looking at you on the sidelines, Iain, and you've literally got to tell them to play one song to close your fantasy festival. So what are you going to have them play?
Well, we're going to do a little bit of a melody, to be fair, because Billy normally finishes with New England, which was obviously covered by Kirsty MacColl. My favourite song of all time, strangely, is They Don't Know, which was written by Kirsty MacColl and then a hit by Tracy Ullman. So I thought, as a tribute to Kirsty, they can do a bit of a melody, and I'll play a New England and then play Kirsty's songs. Terry, there's a guy who works down the chip shop, swears he's Elvis, and then They Don't Know.
Okay, lovely stuff. Again, that's going to VRA, but that's been allowed, so that's all good. So let's lock this one in before we change our minds. So we've got Eclectic Fest taking place at the Albert Hall in Manchester. Opening act, we've got Shade. Super Seconds, we've got Casey Chambers. Taking your Midway Madness slot, we've got Self-Esteem, and she's going to play her album that I forgot the name of, that I didn't write down quick enough. Prioritise Pleasure. Then we got The Wedding Present taking your pre-headline act slot, and Billy Bragg is headlining your fantasy festival. For your encore, they're all going to play a Kirsty MacColl medley of New England, Terry, Guy at the Chip Shop, and They Don't Know. So it sounds great to me, Ian. You're happy to lock that one in?
Yeah, no, delighted, yeah, thank you.
Amazing. So that is in the Fantastival vaults forever. So before we wrap this one up then, Ian, it sounds like the radio show, Indie Brunch, is going from strength to strength. Plans for the future, is it to keep going with kind of the show and the writing for Louder Than War?
Yeah, with the show, I'm coming up to the 100th show, and I was kind of thinking, do I knock it on the head at 100? And then I was thinking, no, I'll carry on. So I've got a few guests already sort of like planned for the next couple of months. But yeah, as long as I'm enjoying it, I'll keep doing it. And then every now and again, I'll do some specials if there's like a box set coming out or something like that. I did one a few months ago, and it was all like interviewing all Manchester punk artists and people involved in the punk scene at the time. So do that. And then writing, yeah, I love discovering new acts. I love, people coming through and thinking, you get, sometimes you'll hear a song and it's like, oh, I want to write about that, so you'll go and do it. Quite lucky, I'm one of the editors now as well, so I do get a bit of freedom to just go and do a bit if I want to do a bit.
Great.
But then I've got other things coming up. I've got Billy Bragg's box set coming up to review. I've got Kirsty MacColl's box set coming up to do, and the Darling Buds compilation as well, amongst other things. So.
Sounds really exciting, Ian. And any gigs coming up that you're looking forward to before we finish? Anything you got planned?
I'm looking forward to Meryl Streep and Pill this weekend. I've got the Soup Dragons gig in October in Manchester. I've got Billy Bragg in Manchester. And then looking forward to seeing Hi-Fi Sean, who's obviously Sean from the Soup Dragons, with Dave McCollman next year as well.
So lots going on in your world. So if anyone is listening and wants to find you, wants to give you a follow on social media, what platforms are you on and how do people find you, Ian?
Best way is probably on Twitter and Instagram. I think it's just at Iain Key.
And that's
Ian.
Nice
and simple.
With an I-A-I-N. Always gets me. It's always a weird one to look at logistically. So make sure you go...
Well, Welsh people seem to put double I at the beginning for some reason.
So make sure to go and give Ian a follow if you don't already. Go and check out his wonderful Indie Brunch show. You will not regret it. So that is it, everyone. Thank you for listening to the 139th episode of the Fantastival Podcast. And if you've enjoyed this one, please subscribe. You can give the podcast a review on iTunes if that's how you're listening, or if you're listening on Spotify, you can also rate the show. So we've been stuck on 45 5-star reviews for the last couple of weeks. So anyone who wants to give us a 5-star review, that would be greatly appreciated. And you can also comment on the episode as well. So if you've enjoyed this particular episode, go and leave a comment about the episode as well. So Ian's on Twitter, so is the podcast. So if you don't follow us, please go and do so at FantastivalP. And if you're not on Twitter and want to contact the pod, you can do that by giving us an email at fantastivalpodcast@outlook.com. Unfortunately, we don't play music on the podcast, but I'll get some tracks from Ian. We'll make a nice playlist. So if you scroll down in the episode description, you'll be able to see a nice little Spotify link there. Hit that link and you'll be able to hear tunes from all the acts that we've spoken about in this brilliant episode. So Ian, 139 done and dusted. Thank you so much for all your support of the podcast and for coming on. How have you found going from, I guess, listening to it to hosting your own show to actually being a guest on this one?
Oh, I've really enjoyed it. It made me obviously think about different bands and stuff like that, and it was great. I really enjoyed it, Steve. Thank you for inviting me on. Hopefully I wasn't as sweary as your last two guests.
I don't think I heard any curses in this one, so I think we'll be all right there. But yeah, good luck with the show, mate. It's a really good show, and you're great interviewing people, and you play some awesome tunes. So, like I said, that's it for this one. I'll be back next week with episode number 140. So please make sure to join me. But until then, stay safe, my Fantastival friends. Please continue to spread the word. And that word is Fantastival. Thanks for listening.